everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion with the one and only Vinod Khosla, the entrepreneur, investor, and technologist who co-founded a number of seminal companies, including Daisy Systems and Sun Microsystems, before launching a storied career in venture capital. First, of course, at Kleiner Perkins in 1986, and later starting his own fund, Coastal Ventures, in 2004. Today, we're going to be talking about, of course, climate tech and whether or not Vinod thinks there was ever the sort of fabled boom and bust, and also how he's thinking about things today in terms of long-term opportunities and short-term opportunities. Vinod, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, great to be here.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You know, it's maybe a funny place to start, Vinod, but one thing that I think is kind of interesting is, of course, the pandemic has had all sorts of ramifications in terms of the way that we work, and investing has opened up widely. And that impacts climate tech as well. I do remember years ago, you thought that Silicon Valley was going to be sort of the epicenter of climate tech. And I do wonder if you think the region missed the boat.
Well, climate tech is really driven by big breakthrough technology innovations, and it has always been more widespread than just Silicon Valley. So, if you look at our portfolio, QuantumScape was in Silicon Valley,
Mhm.
Forterra, the cement company, and hydrogen companies, they've been in Silicon Valley. Our aviation fuels company, LanzaTech, is in Chicago, started out in New Zealand. So it has been widely dispersed. There's a lot of good technologies out of MIT, but there are centers of excellence, centers where there's a lot of R&D in related technologies.
Where are some of those centers?
But clearly, interesting things in Boston, interesting things in Silicon Valley,
Mhm.
mostly coming from some of its semiconductor
Mhm.
roots. But LanzaTech started in New Zealand, and Impossible, of course, Impossible Foods, another one of our companies, started in Silicon Valley.
Right.
But other food companies have started in other parts of the world. Uh, so there has been a concentration in the valley,
Mhm.
but around Boston and MIT, there's lots of talent. And this technology is going to be driven by talent. Some of the solar technologies have been driven from really all over the world,
Mhm.
from Europe to a couple in the UK, a couple in Silicon Valley. Um, First Solar was, of course, not in Silicon Valley. So it has been distributed. It's really focused where the technical talent is when it comes to large innovations. There's other kinds of climate investments too that make sense.
Mhm.
Business model innovations, financing innovations, but they tend to come later when it becomes more like project finance and less technical
Right.
risk.
Right. And so, obviously, COSLA is not focused exclusively on climate tech. I'm wondering how much of the fund is focused on climate tech, and then I guess how your team does kind of scour the globe for these opportunities.
Yeah. So we do look all over for great technologies. We don't allocate a certain percentage of the fund. Or 12 years ago, it was one of the major focuses. Today, it's one of five focuses we have in the fund. So we've always had pretty broad approach to technology-based innovation and disruption as
Mhm.
our key business. That's how we define it. But it could be in healthcare, it could be in fintech. When the fund that invested in QuantumScape also invested in Square, it was the same fund, which is a fintech thing. So we've always had that level of diversification because,
Mhm.
as you know, climate investing has gone in and out of fashion.
Right. And I wonder, I guess of the bets that your team is making, how do you think of it in terms of being kind of, ruthlessly practical versus really long shot opportunities where, if they work out, it would be amazing?
Well, we tend to focus on the higher risk, markets, higher risk technologies that address much larger markets. So, if I can talk about some of the older ones,
Sure.
QuantumScape was a very large return for our fund, was quite some time ago, took a long time to mature, but is going after grabbing a share of the electric vehicle battery market.
Hmm.
Very large market, much more popular today than it was when we invested, but we anticipated EVs would be important. Um, Lanza Tech a while ago went after aviation fuel, um, and that's a very large market, harder to get the costs uh, to where they need to be market competitive. And our
Hmm.
general view on all such technologies is they won't get broad adoption if they don't achieve unsubsidized market competitiveness at some scale. Not day one, but at some scale.
Hmm.
Impossible Foods is another one that addressing a very important area, agriculture of carbon emissions. Um, but these are older first generation things that have been successful. So I always challenge the people who say first generation clean tech was a bust. The people who got in and out quickly, it was a bust. People who
Hmm.
took the patient long approach, um, it seems to have worked out, at least so far. But there are newer technologies that also make a lot of sense. So one of our more recent investments about 3 years ago was in Commonwealth Fusion Systems. Very high risk bet in making fusion power real. If it works, it's a multi-trillion-dollar market, one of the largest markets in the world for power generation. And we think we are on a very, very good path. Just early in September, just around Labor Day, they achieved a key risk milestone, probably one of the largest risks we had identified 3 years ago. But it's a bold bet, and it's a very early bet. But I
Yeah.
think in the next 3 years, they'll be able to prove that positive net energy is possible. But then there's a long cycle after that
Hmm.
of proving of building the first plant and then scaling those plants. But we have a plan that says it should be possible to replace every coal and natural gas plant by 2040. That's very exciting and promising. And as you might guess, a very large economic opportunity.
Sure.
And it was based on one large innovation, high temperature superconductors. And that was the change that enabled this new approach to fusion, um, that we are very, very excited about. Of course, a lot going on in agriculture, also in plant proteins and other areas. Um,
So,
we are doing interesting things in cement, in hydrogen. Um, One of the really exciting things we are doing is completely new ways to do building construction. So we are 3D printing houses, not with cement, which is not the right material for eventually getting the cost to be really, really low.
mhm.
We are doing it with new kinds of materials. And the goal is to improve the sustainability first to 50% reduction in the carbon footprint of construction, and then hopefully to 0% footprint or close to it, while at the same time dramatically reducing the cost of construction. So it's almost hard to pin an area from building construction to agriculture and
Mhm.
hamburgers and plant proteins to fusion research. We still have new solar projects and other breakthrough technologies we are looking at
Mhm.
pretty aggressively.
That's great. Well, they're all such interesting bets. I think low carbon construction is really interesting. I think Impossible Foods is a really interesting story. There are a lot of, I think, investors who are watching this right now and are wondering, want to invest in these technologies, but of course are wondering about returns, or wondering if there's enough capital coming into the market to support sort of longer term bets. And as somebody who's been doing this for so long, I was wondering if you could sort of walk us maybe through some lessons. So one company, for example, I know you've mentioned LanzaTech, which has done really well. QuantumScape is trading publicly now. Another company that you bet on that didn't make it, and of course they don't all make it, is Cure. I think it's
Yeah.
Cure Technologies.
Yes.
That was one where you really put your neck out there. This is a company that went public in 2011, needed a lifeline. I think you threw it one or two, didn't make it. Just wondering if there's any lesson there. Again, these are such long-term bets; it's sort of hard to know how they're going to play out. But
Well, there are,
what?
the lesson is the same as in venture capital. A percentage of companies make it,
Right.
uh, some small percentage are very large returns, and then there's a fairly decent number of failures. It's
Right.
just the nature of the technology risk we have to take. The cure bet did not work. Um, Having said that, in that whole biofuels area, LanzaTech has done pretty well.
Hmm.
Um, Amyris has done well. It was an early well. They've changed their mission because funding was less available for the original mission. So all these pivots and caveats and twists and turns do happen,
Right.
especially since the technologies take a long time. The one message I'd give is a good analogy is biotech pharmaceutical investing. Those things take 10, 15 years from initial conceptualization to a drug approved on the marketplace. It's a long time. Most biotech companies can go public with promising results long before, maybe 5 to 7 years before they have their first revenue.
Hmm.
And there's a fair number of failures in biotech.
Hmm.
And I think clean tech is the same way. It takes a long time. These are hard technologies, so many fail. The ones that succeed, hopefully, are very large returns and can return the whole fund, for a venture fund. And that'll be the nature. So biotech is a good analogy. Now, the one difference in the past was that biotech companies without revenue could both get corporate partners pretty easily and could go public.
Hmm.
But clean tech corporate partners were not super active in the past, and it was harder for them years before revenue to go public. Now, both those things I think are changing, both through the SPAC phenomena we've seen, and Quantum Space did a very successful SPAC,
Hmm.
great returns on the SPAC. So it's not colored by some of the other SPACs that have declined in price. And so I
Well,
do think I hope that sustains because that's needed to solve the climate crisis.
I did want to ask actually about QuantumScape because I know it went out at like 20 and then it shot up to like 130, maybe a month later. And I know it's been trading down significantly this year. I think it's down something like 73%. And so that happens. But I'm just wondering, do you think retail investors understand that some of these bets should be thought of in the same way that maybe biotech should be? Um,
It's very hard to control emotion.
mhm,
There's so to be clear, the SPAC was at $10 a share.
mhm,
So it's up more than 100% from the SPAC price. And we should look at it as an awesome return on
okay.
people who invested in the SPAC that did the merger. Um, Retail investors, look, there's ups and downs um, in these markets, and there's a little too much speculation. So Nicola was too much speculation, Lordstown, and it is sometimes hard for the retail investors to tell the difference between very solid technologies
Mhm.
and less solid technologies or other projections. I think it's important, excuse me, it's important that companies that are doing SPACs be highly cautious about the projections they make. And after they make projections,
Mhm.
at least for, at least for the 4 or 6 quarters where visibility is possible, meet their projections, and so make conservative projections. I
Yeah,
think that's the key to good SPAC behavior.
that's good advice.
And that will happen, I think, over time. SPACs and new phenomena that will change, but companies will be able to do public offerings too, I believe, directly.
Um, that's interesting. I did want to ask about Lanza Tech, which you've mentioned, which is such an interesting company and is on many disruptor lists. And we had CEO Jennifer Holgram at one of our
Jennifer
events last
Holmgren.
year. Why isn't that company public? And I guess maybe like where is the bar exactly for a company to go public? If
You know,
so, it's
it's
pre-revenue.
funny. Each area is a
Mhm,
little bit different.
mhm,
Sustainable aviation is not quite as much in the limelight as, say, electric cars are. So I do think there's a right time and place.
mhm,
They're building a pilot facility to prove aviation fuel, and that's in construction. The thing to realize, construction of a facility like this can take 2 to 3 years.
mhm,
Even after you have a prototype process, proving it at even pilot scale takes 2 to 3 years. And then building plants takes time. And that'll be the nature of clean tech investing.
mhm.
So some areas are more visible than other areas. Mm, um, but you take very old data on nuclear. Um, Toshiba bought a nuclear reactor design for, I think it was well over $1 billion in 1990s dollars, when $1 billion was a lot of valuation and money. So good technology has always had an history of buyout at high prices, um, and and I think that'll start to happen in clean tech too. And I think many more corporates are serious about climate technologies and see it as not so much regulatory pressure as really large market opportunities. As our Commonwealth Fusion effort has an energy company, an oil company, as a co-investor.
Mhm,
That's exciting to see interest of people who want to transition into these new energy sources, new agriculture efforts, all the areas, new steel production, new cement production, new construction methods. Um, it's pretty exciting.
that is interesting. I didn't realize so many corporates were sort of coming in and pouring money into these deals, which makes, of course, a lot of sense considering how fast their industries are
Now we do
changing.
have to hope it sustains. Sorry
Right,
to
that they don't
interrupt you.
come in and out. No, 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 absolutely. I also wonder just we are seeing more climate tech funds being raised right now. It seems like everybody's kind of focused on very early stage investments. Um, do you have concerns about that? Do you think some of these bigger, hedge funds, mutual funds, later stage investors are going to come in, or do you see them starting to come into these deals as well as they are a little bit
Without
farther along?
disclosing any specific deals, I do think there's interest
Mhm.
from people like Tiger and uh,
Okay.
SoftBank and others in these
Mhm.
very large markets. So much more interest is happening. Obviously, many people have invested in plant proteins. That was a sustainability investment given how much of carbon emissions the agricultural sector and specifically animal husbandry is responsible for.
Right.
So we are seeing a fair amount of interest from the larger funds. I think it's public. Temasek invested in a number of these, including Forterra, our cement company. So we partnered with them. It's public. Temasek invested in Commonwealth Fusion with us.
Okay.
So there are interests from traditional investing funds too. That is happening.
And Vinod, right before we go, I think we're out of time, unfortunately, but I just wondered any advice to, um, investors and founders out there, how we sort of drum up even more climate focused founders. Is it a matter of, tapping people on the shoulder in industry and saying, hey, why don't you start something of your own? Do you think
Well,
we're,
the new generation is much more interested in making an impact,
yeah,
making a difference. And these kinds of technologies, by and large, not exclusively, need serious technical talent, really PhDs. And
Mhm.
that's why climate startups are happening around there. So we need more PhDs to start great uh, companies. And it is a little tricky because it takes a long time. And so, but I'm still very optimistic that will happen. And we look at it. My advice to founders is look for people who have experience and patience and have demonstrated the patience to stay with it for a long time. It will come in fashion and then again out of fashion and back in fashion. That keeps happening in the financial markets all the time.
Right. Well, Vinod, we've got to go, but I'm sure I speak for a lot of people who appreciate your enduring passion and focus on this area, which is obviously so important. So thank you.
Thank you.